Okay, so I'm trained as a psychologist. So my area is psychology. So I'm now going to study it as a weapon. So we know historically that Eurocentric Western psychology was not focused on African people having their minds and having minds of their own and having a history. We just talked about that in the last segment. Well, we know there are some psychologists like B.F. Skinner, behaviorist, instrumental conditioning. Skinner box, you heard of that? Pushing a button, seeing what the animal will do, get shocked, receive food. So you're controlling the environment. Well, B.F. Skinner wrote a book called Beyond Freedom and Dignity. Just bring this to your attention because he wrote this book in 1970, 1971. What was going on prior to the 70s, the 60s? Black Revolution and change. So the whole dynamic may have been like, well, you people want your freedom and your dignity, we'll give it to you, but we'll still control you. That's why we're now talking about psychology as a weapon. So we then have a way that we must describe how is it that we're manipulated, but we have to look at the ways that we need to be strong enough to be able to fight that. So the word mentor is not something we really should be using. We should be using the word jegna. So I have a powerful scholar named Moalama Baruti, a colleague of mine who's written several books, but one of them is called Homosexuality and the Feminization of African Males. But he has a story in here about really what the word mentor comes from in terms of the Greek tradition. So we don't want to use that. We want to talk about jegna. 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 It means are those special people who have been tested in struggle or battle, demonstrated extraordinary and unusual fearlessness, shown determination and courage in protecting his people, land, and culture, shown diligence and dedication to our people, produced an exceptionally high quality of work, and dedicated themselves to the protection, defense, nurturance, and development of our young by advancing our people, place, and culture. So for me, the people I'm about to mention are jegnas. So again, not the word mentor. And speaking of my brother Baruti, if you want to check out his books at Akoben House, www.akoben, Akoben House, brother's written like 14, 15 books. The Sex Imperative, Centered, Building an African Reality, Revolutionary Daily Thoughts, one dealing with the whole, I guess you say middle passage, but Kabuka, Remembering the Middle Passage Through the Eyes of Our Ancestors. He actually has a program that he and his queen Ya do every year, honoring those who have been decimated from the Middle Passage, Negroes, and other essays. My goodness. Message to the Warriors, Urugu's Eunuchs. We'll go over the word Urugu later on. European reasoning, an African-centered critique of Eurocentric social science. And again, he got more books than this, but Iwa, a warrior's character. So Walimu Baruti. So he has been at the forefront of trying, contemporary, still alive, trying to provide us with knowledge about us in terms of our thinking. Psychology is a weapon. So in terms of jegnas, he's deceased now, but Brother Robert Williams wrote a book that has a listing of scholars who have been out there. It's called A History of the Association of Black Psychologists, which began in 1968. Told you about that B.F. Skinner book, 1970s, Beyond Freedom and Dignity, thinking they control you. They could give you your freedom, but they still control you. Well, those black psychologists created the Black Association of Black Psychologists in 1968. Left APA, that is the American Psychological Association, to go ahead and establish their own because there was no real point about some of the research addressing African people. So that's a contemporary analysis of the names, but let me look at those who influenced me in terms of my perspective. Franz Ferdinand. If you haven't heard of Franz Ferdinand, wrote four very influential books. First one was called Black Skin, White Mask. He also wrote toward the African Revolution. Also wrote A Dying Colonialism. And on his deathbed, he wrote, that is when he was getting ready to die because he had cancer, was Wretched of the Earth. So Franz Ferdinand has been at the forefront. I think died in 61. He has been like a psychologist or psychiatrist rather dealing with oppression, the psychology of oppression. So I have several books where people have done documentaries on his work. That's by Patrick Ellen. Another one by Irene Genzier. And a very, in my opinion, powerful book dealing with Fernand's work is by Wuhan. It's here somewhere, but it's called The Psychology. Yeah, Franz Ferdinand and The Psychology of Oppression. Excellent book. And then so there are other scholars that have written much work on Fanon because we really need to make his work contemporary. But Living Fanon, all these are by the same author, Nigel Gibson. So Fanonian practices in South Africa and Rethinking Fanon. So these are edited books, but again, the brother has had an influence, and it's really sad that people don't even know the name in terms of him existing. So when you just talk about those who've tried their best to reorient us, there's a white scholar named Stephen J Gould. He's deceased now. Wrote a book called The Mismeasure of Man. Went over how Europeans were using skulls to put marbles in and saying that's how smart you are. The whole issue of eugenics, and that's why we deal with this whole pandemic now, and people who are pushing this vaccine stuff, pushing that are eugenicists. That's people who wanted to sterilize the unfit. So our African scholars have analyzed these things over the years. So with a body of literature, Franz Ferdinand, another body of literature that you should get is by Amos Wilson. Amos Wilson wrote African-Centered Consciousness versus the New World Order, dealing with of Garveyism and globalism. He wrote Awakening the Natural Genius of Black Children. Again, Amos is not with us today, but his work still stands. The Developmental Psychology of the Black Child. The Falsification of African Consciousness. Some of his lectures, a must read. And dealing with his lectures, just came across another book that deals with his work, and his publishing company through Cebu Plateau is still around, African World Info Systems. You can go on the internet and find that, but Issues of Manhood in Black and White, and also The Psychology of Self-Hatred and Self-Defeat. So Amos Wilson's work is still out there. His two books that were very influential to me. One is called Black on Black Violence, because the subtitle of it is just so powerful. The Psychodynamics of Black Self-Annihilation in Service of White Domination. It took me 3 years to read this book, even though it's not thick, because the brother goes into thorough dynamics in terms of our crises, dealing with the gang culture and this creation of desire and us looking at material. And then his magnus opus, 800 pages, Blueprint for Black Power, Amos Wilson. Definitely put it on your reading list. So beyond Amos, another contemporary scholar, still alive, Markbar. powerful books. Re-edited, called New Visions for Black Men, because he wrote a book called Visions for Black Men. It's Naim Markbar. One of his more influential books was called Chains and Images of Psychological Slavery. Also wrote a book called Know Thyself, Natural Psychology and Human Transformation, and Light from Ancient Africa. Naim Markbar. Very influential. Contemporary scholar, still alive, thank goodness. His brother and comrade in arms, Wade Nobles. Wrote a book called African Psychology, my old school version. Got an updated version, African Psychology, toward its reclamation, reascension, and revitalization. He has put all his work together in a book called Seeking the Saku, Foundational Writings for an African Psychology, again, Wade Nobles. He also has a book called Mims, dealing with Haitian history. I have that one located somewhere else. But also helpful for the foundation of black psychology. So this whole issue of miseducation. When I ask students about who created Black History Week and then Black History Month, students, they don't even know, but Carter G. Woodson. This is just a version because some people have done their own versions of the miseducation of the Negro, but Carter G. Woodson set the foundation for us to wanting to know about studying our history. Carter G. Woodson. A brother named Jeff Menzies wrote a book called Dumbing Down to revitalize the work of Carter G. Woodson. He wrote this in 2012. Dumbing Down, Reflections of the Miseducation of the Negro. You can find this at Mind on the Matter Publishing. Jeff Menzies, contemporary scholar. Jeff Menzies has written several other books, but another one is called Practical Psychology 101, a psychological manual for Black Lives Matter and other movements. So, good comrade, Jeff Menzies. Got that one. Yeah, it's it, Dumbing Down. So, with Amos Wilson's work in the United States, and you have a brother from Brazil, a colleague from Brazil, or a scholar, Paulo Freire, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. If you ever get a chance to get your own copy of that, it deals with the whole dynamic of the banking concept or dialogics. Banking concept, you just push the knowledge, like Christopher Columbus discovered America in 1492. Don't ask any more questions, just keep moving on. Dialogics means you get a chance to discuss, well, did he really touch on American soil? So, Brazilian scholar. So when we deal with history and reclaiming and rectifying it, you have our elder who's deceased now, Robert Guthrie, wrote a book called Even the Rat Was White. Even the rat was white. A historical view of psychology, really dealing with Western psychology. Yeah, Linda James Myers wrote a book called Optimal Psychology. Don't have that one here, but Linda James Myers, and we speak of another black woman, not so much psychologist, but anthropologist, with a very powerful book called Yurugu. That's Sister Marimba Ani. Also wrote a book called Let the Circle Be Unbroken, but if you get a chance to get Yurugu by Marimba Ani, thick text on, again, Eurocentric thinking. You heard of Asa Hilliard. That's who I said the first segment with Tony Browder. He has, again, created his site in honor of Asa Hilliard. Asa Hilliard written Testing African American Students. He edited his book. Wrote a book called African Power. Affirming African Indigenous Socialization in the Face of Culture Wars. Also, The Reawakening of the African Mind. And one of Asa's more influential books is called The Maroon Within Us. Selected Essays by Asa Hilliard. Definitely got to know that name. He also did some work with a sister named Nia Damali, who works at the proprietor, owner of Madu Books in Atlanta, Georgia. They wrote a book called Teachings of Ptahhotep. Perhaps you've heard of her, Joy Leary. She wrote a book called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. Very influential, like social worker, scholar, learning about our history, and now has exposed people to understanding this whole dynamic, how slavery has impacted us today. Joy Leary. And we definitely can't forget Dr. Frances Cresswell. Her most popular book is called The ISIS Papers, Keys to the Colors. There's been a revitalization of her work after she's passed. She passed in 2012, but the Osiris Papers, edited by Winbush and Wright, reflections on the life and writings of Dr. Frances Cresswell, our preeminent scholar who has exposed what white supremacy is all about. So she's deceased. Well, so is our brother Kobe Kambong. Helped start the whole approach to black psychology at FAMU. Wrote a book called Cultural Misorientation. Wrote a book called The African Personality in America. And his thick book documenting African psychology called African Black Psychology in the American Context, an African-centered approach. You want to know about black psychology? Definitely go to FAMU. It's interesting that the most recent person who's leading ABC in terms of the broadcasting network is a black woman who went to FAMU undergrad, journalism. FAMU, may Brother Kambong's soul rest in peace. Another contemporary scholar is Bruce Bynum in psychology. One of the more powerful books that I like that he wrote is called The African Unconscious. Roots of Ancient Mysticism and Modern Psychology. He also wrote a book called Dark Light Consciousness. These two books, I think, are very influential. I've also written a book along with him, a book called Why Darkness Matters, The Power of Melanin in the Brain. We're revising it now for another edition, but Bruce Bynum is a clinical psychologist who's also written Transcending Psychoneurotic Disturbances, New Approaches in Psycho-Spirituality and Personality Development. Again, Bruce Bynum, look up his name. He's also written Family Unconscious. So along with these scholars, primarily psychology, perhaps you heard of Ishaka Mussa Barashango. He wrote African People and European Holidays, actually 2 volumes of this. He also wrote a book on African women, the original guardian angel. I think I have that yet. African Woman, the original guardian angel. So you see the name, Ishaka Mussa Barashango. Brother out of Philly, he's passed now. But African People and European Holidays, a mental genocide, as we're practicing, again, the Merry Mess and Misgivings Day, and we don't really know what we're actually practicing because we're following European holidays. Also, African Genesis, amazing stories of man's beginnings. So he was trained as a minister, but again, really a historian. So in general, there's some thick text on psychology. This is one version. This is the 3rd edition. It's now in its 4th and 5th, I think 4th edition. But you have scholars from all over the world and different perspectives, theories, and research. And so there's a whole lot of information on black psychology. There's a scholar named Sean Utsi who actually did a excellent documentary called Toward a Black Psychology. If you get a chance to see that, that will give you a foundation for, again, all these scholars I'm saying. In visual form, I'm just trying to give you the written form. And then, again, over here I have several books that deal with psychology in its research and theoretical expertise. But you got Zebo, you got Reginald Jones, you got Amber Lou, Banks, McAdoo. They've done edited versions on African psychology. I mean, we can't act like it doesn't exist. People have done the research. People have done the research. So, in conclusion, I've covered those who I wanted you to know. You now have your homework out for you to, again, study how the mind has been controlled. And once we now know how to manipulate that, guess what? We can win and get back on top. Okay? The next segment will be on history and esoteric science and how that's been used to control us.